Hi there, and welcome to the Daily Gardener, and thank you for listening. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling. It's November 6th. Today we celebrate the Versailles botanist who started organizing plants in a new way, but kept his method a secret. We'll learn about the young New Yorker and garden writer who met the perfect botanical illustrator for her garden books in the hospital as she was battling influenza. We'll hear some glorious thoughts on November from the author of Butternut Wisdom. And we grow that garden library today with a book that helps us grow more by going vertical in our gardens. I'll talk about burying your cold, hardy succulents, and then we'll wrap things up with the intrepid botanist who discovered a plant that's still almost too good to be true, the blue poppy. But first, let's catch up on a few recent events. The folks over at Ruffled Blog shared a post called Modern Monochromatic Wedding at Baltimore's Sagamore Pendry Hotel. I shared this post because I fell in love with the green and white floral arrangements. They were simple and stunning, and you have to check out the bride's bouquet because there's an air plant right in the middle of it, and it's a stunner. I've never seen that before. I just loved it. Then over the weekend, I ran across a post called What is a Vegan Garden? And I have to confess that I didn't fully appreciate all that it entails. So hats off to the garden teacher at Plu's Garden Design for enlightening me with a thorough and thoughtful explanation. My initial thought was, aren't all gardens vegan gardens? But no. And here's why. Plu's Garden shares the Vegan Society's definition of veganism, and here it is: a philosophy and way of living which seeks to exclude, as far as is possible and practical, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose, and by extension promotes the development and use of animal-free alternatives for the benefit of animals, humans, and the environment. So with that definition in mind, Plu's shared a very thorough post, and I shared it in the Facebook group for the show. And I know it's created a ton of conversation, but I think that's okay. Because whether we're talking about vegan gardening or even just gardening side by side with your neighbor, we're not always going to agree. But I appreciate this new perspective. And again, I want to thank Plu's Garden Design for enlightening me and for opening the door to conversation. And as they point out at the beginning of the article, November is World Vegan Month. So throughout the month of November, there'll be plenty of discussion. And I have to just mention that when I was doing my other podcast, the Still Growing podcast, every November, I would interview Anna Thomas, the author of Vegan Vegetarian Omnivore. And the one thing I learned from Anna is that she was able to put together a Thanksgiving where all were welcome at her table. And that's the point anyway. She once made an amazing meal inside a pumpkin with her son. We talked about that. And we talked about all of the wonderful recipes in her cookbook. So if you want to check those interviews out, just head on over to the Still Growing podcast. Those shows are still available, and search for Anna Thomas, and those shows will pop right up. Now, another great article that I recently ran across was shared in Psychology Today, and it was by Peter Bongiorno, and it was simply called Saffron for Emotional Health. And it turns out that studies show that both the stigma and the petal of saffron are helpful for calming, mood support, and more. And I love the quote that Peter uses to kick this article off. It's a quote by Charlemagne, and it simply says, "An herb is the friend of the physicians, and a praise of the cooks." Love that one. Then finally, Garden Betty shared a really lovely post, perfect for this time of year, called A Guide to Saving and Storing Seeds. As your end of season crops start to fade, now's the time to save the seeds from your favorite plants so that you can grow them again next year. So, Garden Betty has done a great job. She gives you a foolproof guide to show you how to save and store seeds this year. Now, if you'd like to check out these curated articles for yourself, you're in luck because I share all of it with the listener community in the free Facebook group, the Daily Gardener Community. So there's no need to take notes or track down links. The next time you're in Facebook, just search for the Daily Gardener Community and request to join. I'd love to meet you in the group. And by the way, you've got to be in the group if you want to win any of the book giveaways for listeners of the show. And that's going to start tomorrow. So stay tuned. Here's today's brevities. Today is the anniversary of the death of the French naturalist and botanist Bernard Jussieu, who died on this day in 1777. Jussieu was a French botanist who developed the first natural classification of flowering plants. Today, there's a metro station near the Botanical Garden in Paris that's named in honor of the Jussieu family, which boasted 5 members over several generations as notable botanists. Bernard and his brother Antoine were both botany professors in Paris. Bernard was the stronger botanist, and there's a famous story about his incredible dedication to botany. One time, after botanizing in Lebanon, Bernard was sailing back to France. Of course, drinkable water on board a long voyage home would have been a precious commodity. Yet Bernard Jussieu purportedly shared his precious water with a little Lebanon cedar seedling he was bringing home. He wanted to plant it in the royal garden, and he was determined to bring the little tree back alive to Paris. The French say the seedling lived to be over 200 years old and 80 feet high. As for Bernard Jussieu, in 1759, he was brought to Versailles to develop the Royal Botanic Garden at the Petit Trianon. Unassuming and laid back, Bernard quietly began arranging the plants in the garden in a new way. Jussieu's system of organizing plants into a more natural order was revolutionary at the time, and it was also something he wouldn't disclose to others. However, Bernard did put together a catalog of the plants in his garden. Bernard recognized a kindred spirit in his nephew, Antoine Laurent. Bernard trained him for 4 years, and when he came of age, Bernard confided his methods of plant classification. As a result, Antoine Laurent's work was an extension of his Uncle Bernard's ideas around grouping plants. It took Antoine Laurent almost 20 years of refinement and perfecting of his uncle's work, but he finally published it just as the Bastille was falling in 1789. In Genera Plantarum, Antoine Laurent Jussieu kept Linnaeus's binomial nomenclature, but he grouped plants by genera and then into families. He called his system natural and strived to let nature be his guide. Today, many plant families can be attributed to Jussieu. And today is the birthday of the botanist and garden writer Alice Lounsbury, who was born on this day in 1868. Online accounts based on a Who's Who biography have the date of her year of birth as 1873. But I found that's incorrect, as she was already 2 years old on an 1870 census with her brother and parents. No matter when she was officially born, Lounsbury was a New Yorker, and she developed a love for botany as a young girl. In her mid-20s, she was already serving as a board member for the New York Botanical Garden. Lounsbury is forever linked to her friend and collaborator, the Australian botanical illustrator Ellis Rowan. In the late 1890s, Rowan decided to travel to New York. She caused a bit of a sensation during her first trip to the States years earlier, and this trip was no different, except that after her arrival, Rowan contracted influenza, and she needed to be hospitalized. New Yorkers like Lounsbury read about Rowan's illness, and they sent cards and flowers to her hospital room to cheer her. But Lounsbury had an enormous sense of admiration for Rowan, and she felt that she needed to do something more personal. So Alice personally brought a box of fresh picked wildflowers to the hospital and gave them to Ellis's nurse. Ellis was thoroughly charmed by the bouquet and the card, which read, "From one flower seeker to another, and an admirer of your work." The following day, Alice visited Rowan. Even though Alice was 20 years younger than Rowan, the two hit it off. They spent an entire afternoon discussing botany and their work. When Alice offered to show Rowan where she liked to botanize for wildflowers, it was the incentive Rowan needed to get her health back on track. When Alice invited her to illustrate a book on wildflowers that she'd been asked to write, their fates as writer and painter were jointly sealed. Together, they produced 3 books: A Guide to the Wildflowers, which came out in 1899, describing around 500 wildflowers, then A Guide to Trees, which came out the following year in 1900 and described nearly 200 trees and shrubs, and then finally Southern Wildflowers and Trees, which came out in 1901, where Alice wrote this in the preface. To learn something of the history, the folklore, and the uses of Southern plants, and to see rare ones growing in their natural surroundings, Mrs. Rowan and I traveled in many parts of the South, exercising always our best blandishments to get the people of the section to talk with us. Through the mountainous region, we drove from cabin to cabin, and nowhere could we have met with greater kindness and hospitality. Can you imagine what that trip was like? While they were working on Southern Wildflowers, Alice and Rowan's time together was marred by tragedy. They were surrounded by the beauty of the Blue Ridge Mountains when a telegram came for Rowan. Her only son, Eric, she called him Puck, had died in South Africa. He was 22 years old. After finishing these books, the two went their separate ways, and after working with Rowan, Alice continued to write, but without Rowan's artwork, her books failed to attract the same level of popularity. After suffering a stroke, Alice Lounsbury died at the age of 81 on November 20th, 1949. In Unearthed Words, here are some thoughts on November from the author Gladys Tabor from her work The Best of Still Meadow. Walking down the country road this morning, I noticed the swamp in late fall has lovely colors. The chalky purple of the wild blackberry canes, the cinnabar of frosted weeds, and the garnet of oak seedlings seem like music. Farther on, the cutover fields have variations on the theme of brown, from tawny to copper. Squirrels go a-marketing under the hazel bushes, for under the burrs the satiny brown nuts begin to show. A fawn-colored rabbit hops ahead along the gray stone wall, and a pheasant leads 3 females toward the thicket. As I pass the neighbor's old red barn, the smell of dried hay is as sweet as honey. Pumpkins and cabbages and smoky Hubbard squash lie in the garden. Blue smoke rises from a pile of burning cornstalks. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, Keats called it, and also think not of spring, thou hast thy beauty too. Now it's time to grow that garden library with today's book, Vertical Vegetables by Amy Androchovitz. The subtitle to this book is Simple Projects That Deliver More Yield in Less Space. Going vertical is something I love to do indoors in small spaces, but as Amy shows us in this book, it's a strategy that works brilliantly in our gardens as well. Amy points out that when you grow upward rather than outward, you will double or triple the yield from your small space garden. Not only does growing vertically potentially increase your yield, but it also gets your plants off the ground, increasing airflow, reducing the risk from soil-borne disease, and making a crouch-free harvest. Vertical Vegetables is packed with valuable information. Amy includes lists of plants that are best suited for vertical growing, and that's very helpful. The book is packed full of beautiful DIY garden projects that anyone can do, thanks to step-by-step instructions. Beyond the trellis, Amy shares what you can grow vertically using cages, stakes, teepees, a classic obelisk, or pergolas, in addition to providing creative plans for even more functional structures. And here's today's garden chore. It's time to have a funeral. Bury your pots with hardy succulents like hens and chicks and sedums. In a northern garden, you cannot leave your cute little pots with these cold, hardy succulents sitting out in a garden. They won't make it. Or I should say, they won't make it if they're in a pot, if they're above ground. So to avoid the heartbreak of having to rebuy them or the hassle of repotting them in the spring, I simply gather up all of my pots with hardy succulents in them, whether they're terracotta, iron, strawberry pots, etc., and then I collect them all into a cleared area by the water feature. I'll add in my succulent wreath, that's just put together in a wreath form, and then I'll bury it all under a couple of bags of wood mulch. Sheltered under the mulch, the plants will continue to grow until the first hard freeze. Then in the spring, I dig out my pots and my wreath, and then I return them to their homes throughout the garden. Finally, here's something sweet to revive the little botanic spark in your heart. Today is the birthday of the British plant collector and explorer Frank Kingdon Ward, who was born on this day in 1885. During the beginning of the 20th century, Frank Kingdon Ward went on 24 expeditions throughout Tibet, China, and Southeast Asia in search of rare and elusive species of plants. Among his many accomplishments, Ward found the legendary Tibetan blue poppy. Ward's accounts of his adventures are captivating. In 1942, he arrived in New Delhi after a 500-mile walk over mountains and through jungles. The newspaper account said this: "A thin, wiry little man in his 50s, Captain Kingdon Ward, decided that the Japanese were getting too close for comfort. So he loaded 2 60-pound bags of rice on 2 mules, but instead of taking the short road through the Shakun Pass, he decided to travel the 500-mile mule train through Tibet. Kingdon Ward tramped knee-deep in snow and crossed the Himalayas at the 14,500-foot pass. Kingdon Ward said, 'It was a pleasant walk, and my reward is in the finding of dazzling flowers never seen before. You know, they may always blush unseen unless you manage to take them back and make them grow where others can admire them. They are a little bit of the enchantment of Asia transplanted into England or America. And it is satisfaction enough, if you feel in an industrial age like the present, that you have brought home a little beauty for others to enjoy.' Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener, and remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day." The Daily Gardener is produced weekdays in lovely Maple Grove, Minnesota. You can find complete show notes over at thedailygardener.org, and be sure to share the show with your garden friends. You can find The Daily Gardener on all your favorite social media: Instagram, Twitter, and Pinterest, and of course, Facebook. While you're over at Facebook, don't forget to join the Daily Gardener community. Just search for these 3 words, Daily Gardener Community. The group will pop right up, and then request to join. Finally, I want to thank my team at Podfly Productions, where my fabulous editor is Eric Begay. Have a great day in the garden, and we'll see you tomorrow.